When I first got the position, I wasn't sure what to expect. I knew I would be spending quite a bit of time in the forest, and what was expected of me once I got there. However, this was a location I wasn't familiar with, and honestly, this was the first time I had done anything like this. I assumed that I would just be spending a few weeks out in the woods, wandering through the wilderness, admire the gorgeous surroundings, keeping an eye on my little corner of the forest, and report anything strange. I was sitting in the passenger seat of an old beat-up truck with a broken air conditioner. The drive out to this location took nearly a full day of travel. We were always having to slow down to a crawl because of trees and over streams. The driver was a gruff-looking older man with a thick salt and pepper beard. He squinted despite the trees covering most of the sunlight above. He barely said a word for pretty much the entire ride out here. All he did was listen to the same album on repeat. Sometimes I would catch him tapping his thumb on the steering wheel whenever I assumed one of his favorite songs played. By the time that we arrived at the tower, the sun was already descending, painting the sky in beautiful pinks and oranges. I stepped outside of the truck, and for the first time in hours, the man lowered the volume on his music. He told me everything I needed was up in the tower. I said thank you, and with a clearing of his throat, he nodded to me and drove off. Standing before the tower, I tilted my head back and stared up at it. There were maybe 5 or 6 flights of stairs circling upwards to the top of the tower. I glanced around at the area and saw everything was normal. Being left here alone was somewhat eerie, but I had been working or living around the woods my entire life. I ascended the stairs to the top of the tower. A wall of glass greeted me as I passed by. Through the glass, I could see the dark interior. I pulled out a set of keys and unlocked the door. Reaching over, I flipped the light switch on the wall, and nothing happened. Forgetting to start the generator that I had been told about beforehand, I descended the steps and located the small shack on the other side of the tower. After getting the generator up and running, I glanced up and saw the tower was now glowing. The light seemed to pour out like a solitary beacon in the night. I tracked back up the tower and finally took note of my temporary home. In the center was a square table with various papers stacked upon it. Also on the table was a firefighting device used to locate and coordinate with other towers to narrow down where a fire had occurred. On the opposite side from the door was a semi-solid wall, which had various maps and papers pinned to it. One of the papers was a crude drawing of a family, presumably forgotten by one of the previous fire watchers. In the corner adjacent to the map wall was a single bunk bed, with a narrow end table at the head of the bed. The last wall contained a long shelf with a wood-burning stove and a crate of wood nearby. Underneath were numerous containers, some containing dry goods. There were some bed sheets and other things assorted in the boxes, but most of it was just standard things. I wasn't really planning on using the bed sheets. On the wall underneath the larger mat was a rack with a shotgun resting upon it. A small box of shells was placed on a shelf next to it. I wasn't very big on guns, but growing up around the woods you start to appreciate their usefulness. Staring out of one of the windows, I gazed at the sea of blackness. The trees that swayed beneath the tower in the night looked like dark ocean waves. I sighed as my long day's journey was finally catching up to me, and it was time for me to head off to bed. I turned off the light near the door, and as I turned to head back to bed, for a split second, I saw a light in the distance. If it was during the day, there was no way I would have seen it, but with it being so dark outside, it was contrasting against its backdrop. The light was a dull red, and as I looked at it for a few seconds, wondering if it was a fire of some kind, the light began to move. Then, a few more seconds passed, and the light stopped, then disappeared. Confused and tired to worry about it at the moment, I got my sleeping bag and checked to make sure the tower door was secured. I crawled into bed and was dragged off to sleep by the sounds of the forest below me. The next morning when I woke up, my brain was fucking with me. I had forgotten where I was and how I even got there. That feeling passed after a few moments. I stood up from my bed, got dressed, and looked around me. The view from up in this tower was something you can't find in photographs. Gorgeous landscapes stretching as far as the eye can see. Beautiful green trees splitting the horizon, and the clear blue sky taking up the rest. I started a small fire in the mini stove and heated up a pot of coffee. While it was coming up to temperature, I walked over to my radio system and turned it on. I picked up the receiver and called the nearby towers to check in. After a few seconds of static, a voice came through the speaker. He said his name was Peter, and he was in Tower 7. Tower 7 was within line of sight, yet still quite a distance away. I had to use my binoculars just to see the tower, let alone spot anyone inside of it. Another voice chimed in, which was a woman's voice. She said her name was Katie, and that she was in Tower 9. Tower 9 butted right up against the only lake in the area. I knew where it was on the map, and when I used my binoculars to see Tower 9, it only revealed itself as a pinpoint on the horizon. I introduced myself to them as Luke from Tower 8. I sort of comedically rolled the introduction off my tongue, which got a few chuckles from my faceless coworkers. We spent the morning talking about various things, such as our lives and how we all ended up out here, in the middle of nowhere. Eventually, I decided it was time to see what was nearby, as it was dark when I had gotten here, and hadn't had a chance to look around yet. I stepped out of my tower and began a short walk around it. I kept my personal radio on me just in case. I hadn't really seen the need to grab the shotgun, as I wouldn't be traveling too far. As I looked around the perimeter of the tower, I saw nothing. There was a small brook to the east, a clearing, and the trees to the south, which had a lot of flowers laid out inside of it. It was like something out of a woodsy picture book. Other than that, there wasn't much else going on, so I decided it was time to head back up. However, when I turned to make my way back to the tower, I noticed one tree in particular that was different from all the others. This one had large marks carved into it, like some type of animal had brought its claws across it, most likely to mark its territory. I did think about what animal might have done such a thing, and then I continued on my way. As I climbed the stairs back into the tower, I saw the sun was quick on its descent. I gave my neighbors another radio check and wished them both a good night. I locked the door to the tower. I started eating one of my survival meals, as I like to call them, and bedded down for the night. That night, something strange happened. I was awakened by some feeling, not a noise or any other physical force, just something that caused my eyes to drift open. I glanced about without moving a muscle, and spotted something odd. There was a glow coming from outside of the tower, and it seemed to be circling around it like it was climbing the stairs. I started to feel panic growing in my chest as I looked at the shotgun to my left. I tried to calm myself by thinking it was most likely one of the other watchers who had gotten lost and saw my tower. Then, the light rose to the main level of the tower. A dual red lantern was slowly bobbing next to the windows. What was carrying this lantern? I couldn't be sure. Its body seemed strange. It looked like a man, but it had a long curved spine, tracing its silhouette. A weird-looking arm clutched the lantern and held it in front. It seemed to have long hair that dangled down past its shoulders. It stopped just before it reached the door of the tower. Then it quickly turned and faced the glass, looking directly at me. I stared at it with wide eyes. Then a few moments later, it turned and began to descend the stairs. Whether it was fear or being confused, you name it, something must have driven me back to sleep. As I found myself waking up the next morning, I had no idea what that thing was. I'm not sure if it was just a dream, or maybe my brain using my imagination to fabricate something like that. All I know is that I'm basically stuck out here, and that was just the very first day. It's been a little over a week since I arrived at this tower. If I were to be honest, this life really isn't for the faint of heart. The solitude was starting to take its toll on me. Humans are social creatures by nature, and if it weren't for my coworkers in Tower 7 and 9, I might have begun to lose my mind. I might be exaggerating a little bit, of course, but there is some extensive psychological assessment for jobs like these, at least for the company that I work for. I wouldn't have come all the way out here if I didn't think I could handle it. That being said, thinking back on what I experienced on my first night, I honestly thought a screw might have come loose somewhere in my mind. There was obviously no creepy man creature carrying a lantern around the forest. I was randomly stirred awake in the middle of the night, and in my groggy state, my brain most likely fabricated this person from the darkest reaches of my imagination. That's what I've been telling myself, at least. In the days since then, I haven't experienced another nightly visitor. This only seemed to reinforce my original belief. I have seen that red light moving in the woods at night. I didn't see it every single night, and on the nights that I did, I tried my best to dismiss it. Maybe it's one of the other watchers investigating the surrounding area. As unlikely as that thought sounded, at this point, it did help me to calm down for the most part. The days that passed have been uneventful. Thankfully, I had this foresight to bring along a few books to read. With all the downtime, I spent the majority of my time just relaxing in the tower, reading and talking with my tower friends. Whenever I did leave the safety of the tower, I never traveled too far. I always stayed within range of it at all times, never extending myself further than that. Even though I had no reason to investigate my surroundings, it was a nice change of pace from being confined to the glass walls. On day 6, the same man who had dropped me off at the tower showed up to deliver some supplies. I had brought enough to last my entire stay out here, but the wildlife reserve was sure to keep the tower decently stocked. I'll be honest, seeing this man was a much welcome sight. We talked for a bit, and while he was stern and quiet, I still enjoyed his company. He asked me how things were going out here, and I assured him that everything was fine. He unloaded a few boxes from the back of his truck before heading off to Tower 9 to deliver the last of the supplies. I thanked him for the items, and again, he cleared his throat, nodded to me, and drove off. On the 7th night, I was lounging on the outer rim of the tower, staring up at the beautiful night sky above. I was finishing up the last bit of soup that I had made earlier, when my eyes drifted from the cloudy sky to the forest below. In the forest, I could see that glow once again. It drifted around in between the trees. Honestly, it became such a common occurrence that I didn't even think about it too much. It started to drift far away from my tower. Eventually, I picked up my binoculars and looked at it. Normally, that light only remained illuminated for a short period of time, a few minutes max. Except this time it didn't. The glow was lingering and drifting along. I dropped my binoculars and looked back up at the sky. Then around 20 minutes later, my radio in the tower crackled to life. It was Peter from Tower 7. He was asking if we were still awake. I stood up from my chair, almost immediately sighed, responding to his message. He was asking if either of us could see this red light outside of his tower. Katie didn't respond. We just thought she had gone to bed for the night. I, on the other hand, stared at the receiver, not sure why I was so concerned in that moment. It was just a random light in the woods. It wasn't something to be terrified about. However, the fact that Peter was saying something I had personally experienced seemed to send a chill down my spine. I responded truthfully to Peter, telling him that I had been seeing that same light ever since I arrived at the tower. He asked me why I never reported it, and honestly, I just told him because I thought it was one of them. He then asked me if I thought he should go investigate it, to which I advised against it. I told him just to lock his tower's door and remain inside for the night. He did seem a little bit concerned about the situation, but I feel after speaking with me, he managed to compose himself. He mentioned that he was heading to bed, and I did the same. At roughly 2:30 in the morning, I was awoken by the distant sound of a gunshot echoing across the forest. In any other circumstance, there would have been no way I would have heard something like that. But after that first night and the conversation I had with Peter earlier, I went to sleep on a razor's edge. I know I could have heard a pin drop a mile away, so a gunshot was more than enough to pull me from my dreams. I quickly sat up and grabbed the radio, asking what happened, but in the back of my mind, I already knew that one of my tower mates most likely encountered the same thing that I did, even though I didn't want to believe it. After a few minutes passed by, Peter's voice poured through the speaker. He said that he saw something climbing up his tower. He said that when it was going for his tower's door, he grabbed his shotgun and fired at it. The smoke cleared. However, there was no sign of it anywhere, just a pile of broken glass. He cursed himself for making such a fast decision. He went to see if whoever it was had fallen from the tower. When he walked outside and looked over the edge, there was nothing, and no sign anyone had been outside of his tower. Since then, Peter has been making nightly radio checks to both me and Katie. His choice to fire his gun left him without a window in his tower. The barrier that was protecting him from the elements outside had been torn down, and I think that realization was starting to set in. The night following the event, as I stood on the balcony looking around, I saw no sign of that red glow in the forest below. It was truly like it never existed in the first place. I felt at peace once more to not have this feeling in the back of my mind. However, something happened last night that I feel needs to be addressed. I was using the outhouse late one evening at the base of the tower. I stepped outside and was about to make my way back up when I heard something. It sounded like heavy footsteps moving in the trees next to me, like something big was shuffling around. Even with my flashlight cutting through the darkness, there was no sign of anything in the woods. My first instinct was that it was most likely a bear coming into the area at night to look for food. I continued to scan around as the sensation began to creep in the back of my mind, similar to when I would spot that glowing red light. However, this time it felt different, and it felt darker, more ominous, dangerous-like. I was trying to force my legs to run up the tower as fast as I could, but I found myself unable to move. I shifted my light around, hoping and praying that I wouldn't see anything, when suddenly, the loud cracking of twigs to my right sent me into a mad dash up the stairs. I had never climbed a set of stairs that fast in my life before. When I arrived at the top, I locked the door and stayed awake the entire night, with the shotgun resting nearby. This morning, when I went downstairs to look at the surrounding area, I saw where that noise had been made. A tree, which had been no further than 6 feet away from me at the time, had a bunch of broken twigs at its base. There were scratch marks embedded into the tree itself, and in the soft ground below were 2 footprints that appeared strangely human, slightly longer though. The prints that had been left in their wake seemed to signify that it was something heavy. I don't know if this was made by that thing that was carrying that lantern, or if it's something different. All I know is that there is something strange happening in these woods, and I feel like myself and the other watchers are bystanders caught in the middle of it. We still have another 20 days left in these woods, and I just hope we can make it to the end before something truly bad happens out here. I feel like I'm beginning to lose my mind. It's only been 5 days since the last log, but so much has happened I feel like I need to record the events. I had lost contact with Tower 7 with Peter 2 nights ago. His last few messages to myself and Katie were strange. He told us that he was hearing voices coming from outside of his tower, whispers telling him to come outside. He said that no matter where he was inside the tower, the voices would always sound like they were right next to him. He said he took everything that wasn't bolted down and stacked it in front of the big shattered window and door. He tried to contact anyone on the emergency frequency, but received no reply. When he told us this, we all tried to do the same, and it was in that moment that we realized all 3 of us were alone out here. The evening before Peter's radio went silent, he was saying that he could hear heavy footsteps ascending the tower. They would rattle off the metal steps and get right up to the tower's platform before stopping. He said when he looked out of the window, he couldn't see anyone standing out there. He asked what he should do, and to be honest, we didn't have an answer for him. We could hear his distress through the crackling receiver. His radio went silent shortly after that. Both Katie and I tried contacting him over and over again, but every time, no response was heard from Tower 7. I had considered packing up a bag and hiking through the forest to his tower. However, every time I stepped outside and looked down at the trees below, I would turn around and go back inside. I felt terrible every time I tried to attempt and failed. If this had happened on the first day, I would already be on my way over to his tower. But after experiencing what I had been for the past 2 weeks, my brain couldn't push my body down those steps. The morning before, I spent hours just standing on a small ledge outside my tower door, using my binoculars to look over at Tower 7. Even though it had always been fairly difficult to spot from my position, looking at the structure now, it just seemed lifeless, like an abandoned building. I spent the afternoon speaking with Katie in Tower 9. She had been growing more and more concerned with each passing hour. She had been oblivious to the things that both Peter and I had witnessed. She couldn't understand what was happening. Hell, I barely understood it myself. She kept asking me for advice on what we should do about Tower 7, and much like with Peter, I didn't really have an answer. The best I could muster was to tell her to remain in her own tower, and that we'll keep trying to contact Tower 7. Even though I could hear her voice defeated, she agreed. Hours passed, and the sun began to fall from the sky. With the night growing, a chill swept through the area. I began to stack whatever I could in front of the door to my tower. I wasn't sure what I was getting ready for, or if something like this would work, but doing this helped me calm down a bit. As I sat there huddled in the corner, with a small lamp at my side and my gun within reach, I stared off through the window, trying to stay alert. At roughly midnight, something happened. I felt my head beginning to nod as I was struggling to keep my eyes open when the radio crackled for a second. I felt my eyes shoot open, not sure if I truly heard something. The crackling returned a second time, and I walked over to it. I picked up the receiver and asked if it was Peter. A long 5 minutes passed. The silence in the air was so heavy that my watch sounded like a hammer on metal. A voice spoke through the radio, and when I heard it, I dropped the receiver and backed away. The voice was very faint and distant, and yet at the same time, it felt like the voice was right behind me, speaking into my ear. I backed up across the tower until my back pressed up against the cold glass of the window. I felt my breathing become shallow. I had never heard a voice like that before, and it clearly wasn't Peter. I turned and looked in the direction of Tower 7. Even though it was impossible to see in the dark, I was at a loss for words and actions. I slid down to the floor and sat there, looking at the now silent radio. I stayed like this for nearly an hour. I thought about walking over and attempting to contact Katie, but I couldn't force myself to move from the spot. The minutes were ticking by, and I was longing for sunrise to crest over the trees. That's when I heard a sound too, coming from outside the tower. The sound of heavy footfalls on each step leading up to the top. I could feel my heart beginning to quicken. Then, when they grew the loudest at the top of the stairs, they stopped. I stood up and looked through the window across the tower. There was nothing there. A million things were racing through my mind, wondering who or what could have been making that noise. I waited and no more footsteps came. It would have been foolish for me to think this was a product of my imagination. I could clearly hear those footsteps drawing closer and closer. There was definitely something outside of my tower. As I stood in silence, trying to mentally get ready for something to happen, that's when I heard a new sound. A sharp against one of the glass windows. I slowly turned. There was something hanging upside down from on top of the tower. Its head seemed to be floating in mid-air, Long, stringy black hair dangled from its scalp like a torn-off bedsheet. Its eyes were sunken into its face, and they didn't seem to have any pupils. A twisted grin stretched from ear to ear. Teeth like sharp jagged rocks infested its mouth. Long bony fingers held this thing in place against the glass. Fingers that were nearly as long as my forearm. It curled a single finger, wrapping the nail against the glass, over and over again. Despite my fear upon seeing this thing, I did notice that this creature didn't look like the one that had previously carried the lantern. Well, not entirely the same. This one looked demonic, like it wanted to harm me, while the other one just seemed curious, if that even makes sense. It stared at me like a beast stalking its prey. I could feel my throat beginning to dry up and sweat begin to drop from my forehead. I looked at the shotgun resting on the ground near where I was previously sitting. Its teeth began to separate, revealing a slimy black tongue that was licking the glass. Strings of foul saliva dripped against it, nearly causing me to gag. It began tapping harder and harder on the glass. A moment later, my worst fear came to life. The window began to crack. It started where the finger was impacting, then began to branch out like a spider web, until the entire pane was a brutal mess. One final tap, and the entire window would be shattered. When that happened, I felt my body jerk towards the gun. I scooped it up with both hands and fired directly at the window. The sound left a harsh ringing in my ears, and a bunch of smoke filled the tower. A moment later, the smoke cleared, and I looked at the window. There was no sign of it anywhere. I had no idea if I had hit this creature or not. There didn't seem to be anything left behind. My hands were trembling so bad. I stood up and slowly walked over to the window. I looked around for a few moments, and once I was convinced it was gone, I looked over the tower. When I did, I saw something large and dark disappearing into the trees, heading away from the tower. The sun eventually began to rise, and I could feel warmness returning to me after such a cold and terrible night. I contacted Katie and told her what happened. She was in complete disbelief, and honestly, I don't blame her. I'm not sure what to do at this point. I doubt we're gonna make it to the end. I'm not sure how many more shells that thing can take, but I'm gonna run out of ammo eventually, and then it's gonna be too late. I can't stop thinking about Katie and how she could be next. It's crazy thinking, I know, but I feel like I need to go over there to help her. I'm not sure if I will write again, or if I'll even be here. I'm gonna take a day to collect my thoughts, and then I'm gonna leave the tower to find Katie. If you don't hear from me, then it means I failed, and for that, I'm sorry. Three days have passed since my last entry. My bloody hands are trembling as I write this. This experience is leaving a heavy scar on my mind. I guess I should record what happened as best as I can, even though the more I try to recall the events, the more my brain attempts to block them all out. After the sun rose the day after that thing tried to break into my tower, I lost consciousness. The fatigue of being awake all night, combined with the shocking events, were too much for my body to handle. Once the adrenaline subsided, I could barely keep my eyes open. I woke up sometime later in the afternoon to the sound of Katie calling me on the radio. She sounded panicked, scared. When I answered, she practically shouted with joy. She said that after I didn't check in that morning, she had gotten worried that something happened to me. I told her something did happen, but that I was okay right now. I spent nearly a half hour explaining the previous night in as much detail as I could recall. She just remained silent on the other end. Once I finished, she only asked me a single question. What are we gonna do? For the first time in hours, I was finally able to think clearly. I told her that we needed to work together in order to make it out of here. She agreed, and I asked her if she could handle being alone one more night. She told me that she hadn't seen anything unusual so far, and that she should be alright. I made sure to explain that she needed to barricade her tower as best as she could and to keep her gun on her at all times. I then told her that at dawn, I would begin hiking her way. After I got off the radio, I stared at the massive hole where the window once stood. It made me think about Peter, and I wonder if his tower looked like this as well. The sun was already descending, and I spent the entire part of that night packing up my backpack with all the essentials that I could. I made sure my shotgun was loaded, and I leaned against the wall, opposite to the broken window. I wasn't sure if that thing would come back after getting shot at, but regardless, I would be ready if that was the case. Midnight rolled around, and due to my crazy sleeping pattern, I was still alert. I kept my ears open for any strange sounds coming from outside the tower, but aside from the occasional cricket and frog, there was nothing. Then, the radio let out a high-pitched whine before Katie's voice came through. She sounded terrified and told me that something was outside her tower. Upon hearing this, I felt that rush of adrenaline course back into me, and I realized that I had a choice to make. I couldn't just sit around like I had done with Peter. I told her that I was on my way and to just hold on. I truly didn't want to be traveling through the woods at night, but if it meant potentially helping Katie, I had to try. Hearing her panicked voice looped in the back of my mind, I grabbed my bag, my gun, and personal radio, then went for the door. For the first time in days, I stepped outside of my tower. I moved quickly down steps and made note of which way I needed to go to get to Tower 9. I walked briskly, taking care not to sprint because I knew if I injured my leg, then we would both be in trouble. I moved as fast and as carefully as I could manage. Walking through the woods was very confusing. Every tree looked the same as each other. I used my flashlight to maintain my heading as best as I could. I figured if I could at least make it to the lake, then I would be able to spot her tower nearby. My senses during the journey felt razor sharp, as every sound and movement was drawing my attention. I didn't make a note of the time when I left, nor during my trek, but it felt like I had been walking for hours. Trekking through the uneven terrain was beginning to take its toll on my legs and feet. I stopped briefly to rest against a tree, when the sound of a loud, yet distant gunshot echoed around me. The adrenaline that I had felt the previous night, and when I heard Katie calling for help, coursed through my body yet again. I pushed off the tree and picked up the pace. By this point I was throwing caution to the wind, going over boulders and through dense brush. I was practically sprinting through the woods, and after 10 more minutes, I came out from the tree line. I was greeted by the sounds of waves lapping against the muddy shore. I had made it to the lake. After taking a moment to look at the moon's reflection in the water, I turned and saw the light from Tower 9. It wasn't too far away from my current location. As I skirted my way along the lake, I kept my eyes fixed on the glowing tower ahead. I was drawing closer and closer when I thought I heard something in the trees to my left. I froze in place and turned my weapon towards the sound. It was far too dark to make out anything in the trees. I just held my breath and tried my best to focus on any sort of movement. 5 minutes passed without a single sound. Not even the crickets were chirping anymore. I felt my body relax slightly. I turned and continued walking towards the tower. Once I arrived at the base of the stairs, I looked up at the tower, and a strange, yet familiar feeling came over me. It was a feeling I had previously, when I looked at Peter's tower. Like this tower was now abandoned. Dread was beginning to fill me, and as I rushed up the stairs as quickly as I could, when I got to the door, I stopped. Inside looked like a tornado hit it. Books and papers were all over the place. Tables were turned over. I saw no sign of anyone. I slammed my fist against the wall and cursed myself for being too slow. Just when I was about to turn and head back downstairs, I heard something. It was a voice, a whisper, calling out to me. I turned back, and on the other side of an overturned desk, huddled in the corner, was a young woman with dark hair. She was clutching a gun in her hands and was trembling terribly. I held my hands up and told her who I was. Her face seemed to light up as she recognized my voice. Then, that light on her face quickly disappeared in a flash, and she screamed at me to look out. Confused, I turned and was face to face with a large, jagged grin, vacant white eyes inches away from mine. I felt my entire body lock up, and before I knew it, I was thrown to the ground. It happened so fast, I didn't know what happened. I felt my legs start being pulled out of the doorway, and I tried to scramble for my gun. There was no use. I was being dragged forcefully outside. The creature was gripping my leg with such force that I could feel my shin starting to crack. It jerked me around one of the corners of the stairs, slamming me into the railing. Here, my head impacted with the wood, and I could feel blood dripping down into my eyes. I tried screaming for help, but every step I hit while being dragged took the air from my lungs. We were halfway down the tower steps when a gunshot sounded. The creature that was holding me reared back and unleashed a deafening screech. As it did that, it threw its arms to the side. I was still in its grasp, so I went tumbling over the railing and fell from the tower. That was the last thing I remember. I woke up a day and a half later to Katie speaking nearby. I sat up, and immediately I could feel pain shooting through my leg. Katie saw that I was awake and came over to ask me how I was feeling. I could barely say a word, and she told me that everything will be alright. I asked her what happened, and she said that after she shot at the creature and it dropped me, it took off down the stairs into the woods. She carried me back up into the tower and bandaged me up as best as she could. I was surprised that she was able to carry me up the stairs. She said she had been trying to call for help every hour on any frequency, but she hasn't been able to reach anybody. I told her thank you for saving my life, and she thanked me for trying to save hers. I asked her about that night, and she said she heard something climbing up her tower when she called me, but didn't see anything. And when I asked her about the gunshot, she pointed towards the roof. She said she remembered what I had told her about the creature climbing onto the roof of my tower. I looked up and saw different holes letting in faint sunlight in the roof. She said she never actually saw the creature. She just panicked and fired. It wasn't until I showed up that she saw it for the first time. She made us some food, and I spent that evening trying my best to recover. Despite my poor health, I convinced her that we needed to take turns to keep an eye on things until we could get in contact with somebody. Katie's sleeping right now, and to pass some time, I wanted to write this out. However, it's proving difficult with my shaking hands. I don't know what's gonna happen. We still have 12 more days until we're scheduled to go home. With my leg messed up, I doubt we'll be making a run for it. I'm just glad I'm not alone. I know between the two of us, we can hold out until then. I hope we can make it out. This will be the final log of Tower 8. After all the things I have seen out here, I feel like my life will never be the same. The days after I arrived at Tower 9 were rough. My injuries were taking a toll on my body. I wasn't able to move for nearly 2 days straight after I regained consciousness. Thankfully, Katie was around to help me out. She was taking care of everything, as well as helping me up and down the tower. Well, to go out and use the bathroom. It was embarrassing being so helpless, but she never made me feel like a burden. We continued taking turns watching over one another. We were hoping that the ranger who had brought us out here would have done another supply run of the towers, but as the days went on, it seemed more and more unlikely. The first handful of nights that followed me were uneventful. There had been zero indication that whatever that creature was had come back. I wanted to believe that the blast it took drove it away to die alone in the woods, but I knew it wouldn't be that easy. After 3 full days of watching and waiting, something finally happened. I was taking up my nightly watch as Katie was heading to bed. I stared at the night sky from where I was sitting at, opposite to the door. To pass the time, I've been reading one of the books that Katie had brought along with her, a cheesy romance novel. but at least it was something to keep my mind occupied. As I was reading by the candlelight, my eyes closed for a split second, and when I opened them, there was nothing but darkness. The candle had gone out, and only a faint ribbon of smoke twisted in the moonlight before me. I sat up and looked around. A light breeze caressed my face, and I turned. My heart began to thunder in my chest as I saw the tower door open. My eyes snapped over to where Katie had been sleeping. It was empty. I scrambled to my feet, and in doing so, a piercing sensation shot up from my leg, spreading throughout my body. It was like my insides had been set on fire, and after a few deep seconds, the pain slowly faded. I grabbed my flashlight and shotgun and went out into the tower's ledge. I called out for Katie as loud as I could. A few birds in the nearby trees scattered from the branches. I limped down, feeling needles in my leg with each impact. It took me ages to reach the bottom of the tower. When I stepped onto the dirt, I stopped and looked around. I called out once more for Katie as my fears were starting to fill up my mind. The echo of my voice faded, and for the first time, I felt completely alone. I was just about to resign myself to defeat and climb back up the steps when I heard something in the distance. A screaming sound, coming from deep in the woods. I thought about climbing back up the tower to grab my backpack, but I didn't want to risk losing Katie because I took my time to climb back up. I started to limp quickly towards the scream. Every step was agonizing. I had to take so many breaks with every handful of steps or so. I called out, and just when I thought I lost track of her, I would hear a new scream. Sweat started to soak through my clothing, making my body feel 10 times heavier. Thoughts were racing through my mind, wondering what I would do if I found her. After an hour of walking, I entered a small clearing in the woods and I called out again. The scream that returned was extremely close now. I pushed my way through, and I saw them. Katie was being dragged away by the creature. Where they were heading to, I didn't know, but that didn't matter. All that mattered was saving her. When she saw me coming out from the trees, she called my name in desperation. Upon hearing my name and seeing what was happening, I pressed the butt of the shotgun into my shoulder, took aim, and fired. The creature screeched and dropped Katie into the dirt. It turned to face me, and I could feel its hatred in its eyes. I felt like I had just whacked a bear with a twig. It began moving along the ground towards me like a beetle. Everything happened so fast I was unable to raise my weapon for a second shot. It swatted the gun from my hand and gripped me by the neck. It raised me off the ground and stared at me with those vacant, wide eyes. The creature was no longer grinning. Its face was twisted. I could feel my throat beginning to close as its grip tightened. I looked over at Katie, who was lying on the ground. I could feel my life getting close to its end. My eyes began to close, and I was thinking my last thoughts I would ever have. Suddenly, the creature released its grip, and I hit the ground hard. My leg striking the dirt caused me to unleash an ear-shattering scream. When the pain began to fade, I looked up and saw the creature clearly cowering away from me. It was the first time that I could see it so clearly, its grotesque humanoid form. And then I looked down at my hands and realized I could see myself clearly as well. It took me far too long to realize that there was now a light filling the area around us. I turned, and standing not too far away from me was that thing that I spotted on the first night. It was holding it out in front of its body, and what was once a dull red glow is now a bright orange, like it had somehow captured a piece of the sun in its hands. The other creature recoiled and shrieked in agony before its skin began to slowly flake away. It seemed like if the light from the lantern was burning this creature alive. Then, with a single brilliant flash of light, the area dimmed, and the creature that had attacked both Katie and I was no longer there. I sat up and looked at the figure that was carrying the lantern. It looked like a man with a curved spine and long stringy arms. It had long hair that was hanging past its shoulders. For the first time, I could see its face. It was the face of a simple old man, warm and caring, like a grandfather. He said no words but gave me a faint smile and a nod. He raised a finger and pointed to Katie. Understanding, I quickly went over to her. After a moment, she regained consciousness. When she spotted the man, she pulled back in fear, but I told her not to worry. I asked if she could walk, and she nodded. The man carrying the lantern made a follow gesture with his hand and led a path through the woods back to Tower 9. When we emerged from the trees, he stopped and turned to face us once again, despite my dry and hoarse throat. I said thank you. He returned the simple nod and began to head back into the forest. Before he could leave, however, I said sorry, and he stopped briefly. Sorry about Peter, I said. The man turned and gave me a mournful glance before continuing on into the woods, the faint red light disappearing shortly after. We slowly climbed back up into the tower. Not a moment after walking inside, we both collapsed against the wall. We sat together in silence, too tired and sore to move. Katie's voice was trembling as she broke the silence a single time. Thank you, she whispered. I couldn't find my voice to respond. I just held her hand tightly. Katie passed out a few moments later, and I held my notebook in my hands. I was about to start writing, but before I could move my pen, my eyelids began to close, and I fell asleep. I woke up a few hours later. The sunlight was piercing the windows, shining directly into my face. Through my blurred vision, I saw somebody standing in the doorway of the tower. In a panic, I scrambled over and got Katie's shotgun that had been left behind. As I turned to aim it, a voice called out to me, a deep voice telling me to take it easy. In that moment, my vision cleared, and I saw the ranger who had brought us out here. Recognizing him, I dropped the gun and felt tears coming down my eyes. I nudged Katie, who stirred from her sleep and saw him. She was only able to give a weak smile. The man walked up, and his stoic demeanor was flooded with looks of concern and worry. He said he stopped by Tower 7 and 8, and when he found them both empty, he was beginning to fear the worst. He did ask what happened, and we couldn't seem to find the words to answer him. He helped me and Katie to our feet and told us that he was gonna get us out of here. As we walked down from the tower to his truck, I stopped one more time to look at the forest, and then back up to the tower. After getting inside the truck, Katie and I both sat in the back seat. As we drove, the ranger was asking us again what happened. I was thinking carefully. I considered lying to the man because he might think we had gone insane out here. With a heavy sigh, I explained everything to him in detail as I could remember. He didn't say a single word the entire time. He was just driving and listening. Once I finished, he paused for a few moments, then began to speak. He said he's been a ranger out here in these parts for many years. He said he used to hear stories about this place. He said that 80 years ago, there lived a man and his son in a shack in the woods. They were living off the land, off-grid. And then one day, something attacked them in the night. The father watched helplessly as the monster tore his son to pieces. When it turned to the man, he reached for anything to shield himself from the monster's advance. He grabbed a nearby lantern and held it in front of him. The monster recoiled in fear and ran off into the woods. People say that the man, filled with grief over the loss of his son, has been wandering the forest with a lantern, keeping that monster at bay for his son's sake. The ranger said it was just a ghost story that the locals in town like to tell. He said that all his years working out here, he never saw any evidence to these rumors. Well, not until now. I'm currently sitting in a hospital bed writing this out. Katie wasn't nearly injured as I was. After taking some time to think about what the ranger said, I think I'm starting to understand what happened out there. This is just my personal theory, so I don't know for sure, but I think that the man carrying the lantern was keeping an eye on the towers. and searching for that monster. When he went over to Tower 7 and Peter shot at him, he ran away or disappeared, with the lantern carrier gone. That allowed the monster to run free throughout the forest. I'm not sure what caused the man with the lantern to come back and help us, but I'm thankful that he did. We most likely wouldn't have survived if it wasn't for him. I'm not sure what that monster was, or where it came from, or why that lantern stopped it. Maybe it thought it was some holy relic, or it most likely just hated fire. Regardless, I just hope to God that no one else ever has to see it for themselves. The ranger stopped by to let me know that he reported Peter missing, and that law enforcement said that they'll be conducting searches for him soon. I hope they find him. I hope he survived somehow, even though in the back of my mind, I know it's unlikely. If any of you come across these logs and find yourselves heading into the woods, maybe for recreation or work, I hope you understand the dangers out here. Be cautious, be vigilant, and be safe. As for me, I'm never setting a single foot inside of a forest ever again. My name is Luke, and this is the final entry for Lookout Tower 8. I'm in a crappy band with some old high school buddies. A few weeks ago, our bass player, Parker, informed the rest of the band that his parents had flown to Europe and left their house for us in Fort Collins. His dad is a sound engineer and has a recording studio in the house. We were pretty excited, so we packed light and made the drive from Cali to Fort Collins, ready to track a backlog of 8 songs we've been sitting on. It was mid-spring, and the mountains looked pretty beautiful, oceans of blue and yellow wildflowers. The drive was long, but it was nothing short of exciting. In fact, everything was so beautiful that one night after a recording session, Parker suggested we go camping. I laughed at the idea. They all knew I had somewhat a negative experience in the Rockies a few years ago, but Ronnie and Jeff jumped on board. Parker recommended some vanilla tent camping at the foot of the mountain, but Ronnie had a bright idea. He wanted to do some astrophotography, and for that, he said, we need to go to a place that's really dark. So he spent some time on Google and discovered Comanche Peak Wilderness, a remote section of a popular national park. What a great idea, I remember chirping. Surely nothing could go wrong, right? Of course shit did go wrong, and it started on the drive up there. People always forget that quote-unquote evening begins at around 3 p.m. in the deep woods. As soon as the sun starts to dip behind the treetops, the gloom sets in and things get eerie, but my body rejects it because my brain knows it's too early for dark. I was on edge the second that the paved road gave way to dirt. The other thing people forget is just how loud the woods are at times, and how silent they are at other times. The contrast between them can make your head spin. One moment, it's a symphony of owls and crickets and toads. Then a branch will snap, or thunder will crack, and suddenly, you're wondering if you've gone deaf. Then of course, if you think about it too much, you realize just how full of darkness is, with all those watchful eyes. We went in as deep as we could. We left Parker's truck on the side of some forgotten road and hiked about half a mile into the trees. There was no trail. We followed the GPS to a tiny lake that was somewhere uphill, where Ronnie could set up his cameras and get a clear view of the sky. We hadn't crossed a solitary soul after entering the preserve for a few hours prior, and I felt kinda nervous about the fact that no one knew where we were. By dusk, we had set up 2 tents that Parker had borrowed from his parents. We made a small bonfire pit between them and hanged all of our food up in the trees like you're supposed to. Ronnie set up his cameras along the shore, and then we waited for nightfall. My anxiety got worse as darkness ate away at the sky. The guys didn't notice. They drank and smoked and carried on. And of course, right when the world turned to black, the leaves began to crunch in the distance behind our tents. A girl emerged from the trees and stopped at the edge of our little clearing. This girl must have been 8 years old and was wearing a white dressing gown, like she had just woken up. She had platinum blonde, almost white hair, and skin so pale that she looked like a ghost in the firelight. She wasn't carrying a flashlight or anything. She had been walking in the pitch black forest. She squinted at our fire as if it was annoying her, and she let out a few wet coughs. We all just stared at each other in confusion as she studied us. There were no roads or trails in this area. This was not a campground, and her presence made no sense. Jeff eventually called out to her, asking if she was okay, and she replied, "My mom's sick. Can you guys come help us?" Where is she?" Jeff asked. The girl just pointed into the forest. The trees and shadows and mist clustered together to form a great big wall of nope. I gave Jeff a fuck no head shake. I might be a coward, but I'm not about to disappear by some evil wood ghost. Ronnie stood up and asked the girl if they were camping or if they had a house or what. The girl just said, "She's really sick. Just follow me." Then she started coughing again. At this point, all four of us could sense that something was wrong. Parker, the most clever of all of us, invited the girl to come warm up by the fire and explain what was going on. I think he knew she would decline. The girl just turned and walked back into the trees, coughing as she went. But before she vanished, she turned around and said something, but we couldn't be sure of what. I heard, "So, you'll be a liar." But Ronnie said that he heard something different. "Soon, you'll meet the liar." We built the fire up a lot more, mostly to keep a good perimeter against the darkness. All of us were creeped out, but after a few hours the guys had forgotten about the girl. They just laughed and told stories. At some point, Jeff and I went to the tree line to take a piss. I walked about 10 steps into the woods and blasted the dark with my flashlight, with Jeff following closely behind. I wanted to see if there was a clearing on the other side, or a footpath that the girl might have followed, but there was nothing, just impassable trees. That's when we heard Ronnie shouting something, so we jogged back to the fire and saw him examining the southern edge of the clearing. That was the direction we had left the truck in. Parker said as we passed by. He's saying that he thinks he heard more footsteps. I also heard them. Standing next to Ronnie, I could make out a new pair of feet trampling the leaves in the darkness. It was louder than the girl had been, most likely bigger. "Show yourself," Ronnie shouted. To my surprise, a woman answered him. She laughed and said, "Don't shoot. I'm just a hiker." We moved back and watched her step into the clearing. She was most likely in her late 30s and was wearing a raggedy hat and an old beat-up pack. I remember having Parker grumble something like, "Real private spot you found here, Ronnie." And I agreed. How the fuck were all these people bumping into us way out here? The woman introduced herself as Sarah and apologized for scaring us. Ronnie demanded to know what she was doing out here, and she explained that she had done the full day loop around the mountain, but got lost for a while. She claimed to have found her bearings and now knew where she was going. "You know the way back?" he repeated to her. "Yep, in the dark without a flashlight?" I know this area pretty well." But Ronnie wasn't buying a word of it. He turned back to the rest of us and said, "We're getting cased, you guys. We're about to get robbed. As soon as we fall asleep, campers get killed by thieves and crackheads all the time." "Well shit, thanks for bringing us out here, dumbass," Jeff said. Sarah laughed again. She was real smiley for a woman lost in the woods. In the dark, that is. "I swear it's nothing like that," she said. "Look, I'll be on my way." For whatever reason, I felt the urge to press further. So I said, "You know you're not the only person we met out here who's walking around without a light."
That fake little smile fell off of Sarah's face, and it took the wind right out of my sails. She stared at me like she could see down into the deepest places inside of me. "You met the little girl?" she asked with a blank expression. Everybody else I exchanged looks. Sarah collected herself and a new smile spread across her face. She said, "Don't listen to anything that little brat says. She's a liar. Look, why don't you guys hike down to the ranger station with me? It'll be safer together." And she pointed into the woods behind her. Something lit up in my brain at that moment. This was the second time a stranger had tried to get us to go into the dark. We weren't going to get robbed. Something much worse was about to happen. Parker seemed to have come to the same conclusion, and he invited Sarah to instead join us around the fire. As he knew with the little girl, he knew that Sarah would decline. The strange woman then told us she had to get back before it got any colder, and with that, she turned and hurried into the trees. After a long debate about what to do, we decided that hiking back to the truck was the fastest way to get lost or killed. We hadn't used the trail, and our phone batteries were low. Every time the wind blew, it set 1,000 trees groaning and shivering, which made it impossible to know by sound. And it was so black that if I stared into the darkness long enough, I started having minor hallucinations as my brain tried to make sense of the void. So we kept the fire blazing and agreed to sleep in two-person shifts. Since Parker and I were the most sober of the bunch, we agreed to stay up first. But only an hour into our watch, we started hearing the coughs and sputters of a little girl in the distance. I followed Parker to the lake's edge, which lay about 30 yards from our camp. There, we started hearing an eerie voice in the breeze, and I saw the silhouette of a person milling about near the water, about a few hundred feet away, and I realized it was the girl. She was wandering around in the dark. We booked it back to the fire and woke up Jeff and Ronnie, telling them about the girl's presence, but as we discussed what to do, another voice erupted from nearby and began singing as well. It sounded just like Sarah. Parker and I jumped into the tent with the other guys and sealed it up, terrified that the time had come for whatever these creeps had planned, but no one approached our camp. The two people just walked in slow half circles behind the trees, singing together in a language I couldn't identify. Ronnie always keeps a menacing looking trail knife on him whenever we go hiking, and he scrambled for it while shouting that he'll kill anybody who came near us. His yelling caused the people outside to go quiet for a few moments. I pulled out my phone to record some of the voices, but my hands were shaking so much I could barely operate it. I caught a bit of the girl, but then something even more weird happened. None of us are sure of how many people were in those woods, but we heard a third voice at that moment, and it was deeper and guttural, like the sound of some night creature stalking around in a jungle. I'm not sure the noise was made by a person. Ronnie and Jeff believe the sound is coming from the girl, who has a coughing fit, and then begins channeling some demonic voice. Parker and I think it's a third person or an animal that was with them, waiting for us to leave the safety of the bonfire. Here's a sample of the recording. Sorry for the poor quality. I have a crappy phone. After the commotion, the activity in the woods died down for a while. The guys and I remained inside the tent, terrified, only leaving it to throw more wood on the fire about once an hour. None of us slept, and for the rest of the night, we heard distant singing, laughing, coughing, and the occasional whisper. Sometimes the girl would say, "Can you help us?" in the exact same tone, as if her voice had been recorded and replayed over and over. We also heard someone, most likely Sarah, climbing a nearby tree and shouting things like, "I see you boys," and "Let's go together, it's safe now." And that was it. By dawn, we were exhausted from fear and half frozen in the tent. The noises stopped and the people, if there were people at all, had long abandoned their efforts to draw us into the dark. We packed up and hiked back to the truck, which had thankfully not been ransacked. As far as I'm concerned, the next time I go camping, it'll be in a treeless desert in Arizona. And I'll see if I can get Ronnie to post some of those night sky shots.
My aunt told me the story. We're actually related by marriage, so she has a whole new set of Skinwalker stories that I would like to share with you. This story took place when she was a child. My aunt's family lived in a community about 20 miles south of Gallup, New Mexico. The area is far different from where I live. My house is surrounded by desert, and you don't really see trees until you move into the canyon. Bread Springs is a forested area, and it's where our story takes place. Like many people on the res, my aunt's family didn't have running water or electricity. In order to get some, they would have to drive into town and pull water back in large containers. The containers are huge and easily fit in the bed of a truck. Her family would place 2 containers on a long flatbed trailer to make the best of each trip. So her family went into Gallup, filled up the containers, and went around town doing other types of business. Back then, seatbelt laws weren't so strict, and so my aunt and her siblings sat in the bed of the truck as they went around town. It began to get dark, and so the family started going back home. Most roads weren't paved, and so they had to drive very carefully because of the trailer as well. The lights of town faded away in the distance, and soon the vehicle was surrounded by darkness. They drove and the kids sat in the back and talked among themselves. However, that was until my aunt noticed something. There was a figure crouched by the furthest water container on the flat bed. The truck wasn't barreling down the road, but it was going at a speed that would be impossible for anyone to run and jump on. My aunt nudged her siblings, and they all paused to look at the dark figure. They all got silent and squinted their eyes to look. It was too dark to really make anything out, so they ignored her and continued to talk. My aunt kept her eye on the figure and pulled hard on the sleeve of her brother when this thing began to crawl over one of the water containers. The kids all stopped and watched in fear as the figure began to move carefully over the second container. My aunt said that the figure looked like a person. However, its limbs were abnormally long. With these long limbs, it was pulling its body closer to the kids. At this point, they began to scream and cry. They banged on the window of the truck. At this time, the creature was reaching for the tailgate of the truck. Due to the huge commotion that was now going on in the bed of the truck, the driver slammed on the brakes. The creature hit the tailgate and fell down in between the truck and the trailer. The driver rolled down the window and asked what was going on. The kids screamed at the driver to go. They weren't sure they were safe until they saw that the trailer moved up and down as if it ran over something large. When my aunt told me the story, I sat in disbelief. She told me she was uncomfortable when it was crawling on the trailer, but true fear rang through her body when she saw its eyes. I asked her what she meant. She said that they were like teddy bear eyes. I didn't quite understand what that meant until I pressed further. She said that its eyes were shiny. When you shine the light in the eyes of an animal, they reflect back. The brake lights were shining, and whatever they saw that night had eyes that were glowing back. It was late June of 1968. My dad was 12. My grandparents had moved a few months earlier from Tucson, Arizona to Concho, Arizona. Concho was very different, both in landscape and temperature. Sitting at 5,000 feet above sea level, the summer temperatures were around 70 degrees versus the hundreds in summertime Tucson. Resting at the edge of the White Mountains, the land is red, yellow, and brown sandstone cliffs and buttes against a larger ancient basalt flow ridge that lines the north from the Springville volcanic range. Well, Old Concho, as it's referred to now, sits among the high desert with large basalt ridge bordering the east and north. In the valley, a dry riverbed was dotted by large cottonwood trees. The buttes and ridges boasted large twisted cedar trees. Only about 200 people lived in Concho at the time. It's in pretty close proximity to the petrified forest. Therefore, petrified wood was found on the valley floor. There were also numerous ancient Anasazi ruins scattered along the valley. My great-uncle had moved his family to Concho as well. My grandpa had recently finished his engineering degree, and he and my great-uncle were doing highway construction all around the White Mountains. They had both purchased land in the Concho area for pretty cheap. My great-uncle had two sons who were a year older and a year younger than my dad, Tony and Zach. Tony was 13 and Zach was 11. They would spend their days exploring the surrounding landscapes, joined by my dad's American bulldog, Sarge. They had found quite a few ruins, numerous pictographs, and some old abandoned homesteads, most likely from the 19th century. Every morning, they would load up their bags with canteens, bologna sandwiches, and head out into the wilderness to play and explore. My grandparents and great aunt and uncles had only one rule that was for the children, and that was to return by sunset. As my dad recalls, on one summer morning, they ended up hiking towards the edge of the giant basalt ridge to explore. After going for about a mile or so, they came upon an arroyo running adjacent to the ridge. Large black boulders and giant slabs of sandstone peppered the wash. The banks were pretty steep, but they would have to cross it if they want to explore the ridge on the other side. They made their way down slowly. Once in the arroyo, they realized that the opposite bank was too steep to climb, so they started following it west to find a better place to climb up. My dad said as soon as they got into the riverbed, he started getting an unnerving feeling, like they were being watched. He said it was extremely quiet, no birds or cicadas chirping. It was hot as well, no breeze stirred the air. The further they walked down the wash, the more a sense of urgency began to build in his gut. He didn't say anything though, for fear that his cousins would laugh at him. About a half mile or so down the wash, it made a bend around a large volcanic boulder. Suddenly, Sarge began a low growl, hair standing up on his back. This actually startled all three of the kids. Looking around, they didn't see anything, so encouraging the dog, they moved closer to the bend. Sarge stayed rooted to the spot, growling and barking. All three of the boys began to get scared. They agreed that maybe they should just turn around. They noticed that there was a spot where they could climb out of the wash. They hadn't noticed it at first, but it looked almost like a game trail. With adrenaline fueling them, they hauled ass up the side of the embankment towards the ridge, the dog darting after them. The whole time the bad feeling was growing stronger with my dad. They stopped at the top to catch their breath. Sitting against a large boulder, they took some drinks from the canteen and assured each other that Sarge probably smelled a coyote or spotted a rabbit. Here, The game trail was more apparent. It had even worn into some of the volcanic and sandstone that protruded from the ground. They noticed that there were a lot of petroglyphs dotting the black rocks, geometric shapes, animal, human figures. There were so many. Finally, they found a large juniper with a trunk and ate their lunch in shade. Bellies full and excitement replacing fear. They hurried along the trail as it slowly zigged and sagged the side of the basalt ridge, avoiding large areas of rock falls. The pictographs began to change as well along the trails. Lots of spirals and horn-looking men. My dad even said there was one that looked like a UFO. Turning around a bend, the trail disappeared. Only open space of the edge of a cliff. There was nowhere else to go. The cliff dropped off to one side, and a sheer cliff going up about 50 feet on the other side. My dad, he was disappointed, but also a little relieved, as the sun was getting further west, and they were pretty far from Concho now. They could see the town in the distance, as well as the holy mountain and mesas that dotted the distant Navajo res. Even though they were disappointed, they decided that it was worth looking at the view. They started making their way down the trail when they spotted an opening in the cliffside, a side canyon. They hadn't noticed it on the way up. It was behind a large twisted cedar. The tree's shadow had hidden it. It looked almost like there was another trail going into the divide. The opening was about 4 feet wide. Looking at it, that unnerving feeling returned to my dad. His stomach dropped and he felt like it was twisting in knots. The hair on the back neck stood up. Tony suggested that they should detour and check it out. My dad protested, saying that they needed to get back. Zach stayed silent. He looked as scared as my dad felt. Tony laughed when looking at them and called them both sissies. He said if they didn't want to go, it was fine, that they could wait there for him and be babies if they wanted. That's when Sarge ran down the trail and was out of sight. My dad whistled for him, but he didn't return. Zach decided he would follow Tony, so my dad stayed behind while they entered the narrow black walled canyon. When they moved out of my dad's field of vision, the wind picked up, blowing through the canyon and trees, making a creepy sound. It was quiet except the wind, and my dad thought he heard faint voices on the air. He shivered, the ominous feeling growing stronger. 10 minutes passed, then 20, and still, Tony and Zach had not returned. A large cloud had covered the sun, and drops of rain began to fall. My dad moved under the cedar to get out of the light rain that began to fall. He sat on a rock and began to shiver. Suddenly, something grabbed his shoulder. He jumped about 3 feet and screamed. Then he heard laughing. It was Tony and Zach. They looked extremely excited. "Luke, you'll never believe what we found," they said. "We found some Indian steps and they lead to a cave." They begged my dad to come see. It wasn't far, only about 10 minutes into the canyon. My dad ended up following them, knowing they weren't going to agree to go home until they showed them. Plus, he felt a little braver and more intrigued now. Sure enough, around a bend, and about 20 yards into the canyon was more wide, about 20 to 30 feet across, and there were indeed foot and handholds carved into the rock wall. My dad had seen steps like them before, when his parents had taken him to Chaco Canyon National Park. They were smaller than the ones in Chaco, and only went up about 20 feet to the darkened mouth of a small cave. He shivered, from excitement or fear, he wasn't sure. From the bottom of the canyon, there was no way of telling how large the cave was. They dropped their packs and decided to use the foot and handholds to climb up to the cave, against my dad's better judgment. The rain had stopped, but they slowly and carefully made their way because the rock had become slick. It took about 10 minutes to ascend. My dad called for Sarge from the top again, and the dog still hadn't returned. The cave was much larger and deeper than they expected, and the entrance was decorated with hundreds of petroglyphs. The light didn't penetrate very far in, but they could see light in the distance from an opening in the roof, so they entered. Light adjusting to the dark, they started to notice that the ground was covered with objects. What looked like rocks and debris now revealed itself to be pots, beautiful, painted pots of all shapes and sizes, black on white, painted with geometric patterns, and animals, red pots and even some yellow ones, large pots holding dried corn and crusty squash and beans. There were also pots filled with arrowheads and beads. They even found some instruments like drums and flutes. They didn't touch anything and kept walking deeper into the cave. They looked around in shock and in awe. They had just discovered something big, something very big. They moved now towards the second bit of light streaming in from a crack in the roof. The cave was littered with all sorts of artifacts, stone axes, pots of all shapes, colors, and sizes. As they passed under the crack, they noticed now that there were objects in alcoves in the wall. My dad moved closer to one, and his blood froze. He was looking at a human body. It was decayed skin and hair clinging to patches and its mouth open in what looked like a silent scream. He took a leap back. Tony and Zach also froze. The walls were lined with alcoves filled with dressed bodies, lining the walls as far as they could see into the darkness. Suddenly, an ominous and horrendous screech broke the silence of the cave. All three boys jumped, and my dad, looking in the direction from where the sound came, saw two red and glowing eyes. He froze, locked in place by those glowing red eyes. Suddenly, the cave was washed over with the stench of decay and death. The eyes began to move towards the boys. Slowly, another hideous growl, screech, jolted them from being petrified in place. The eyes were moving fast now, right towards them, and they heard what sounded like running footsteps. They turned and tore out of the cave as fast as they could. They ran as fast as their legs could carry them in a blind panic. The entrance to the cave was maybe 30 yards away. My dad looked back against his better judgment and saw a man on all fours, or a giant coyote. He can't be sure. He pushed himself faster, screaming for the others to also run faster. They reached the edge of the cave, having to turn around to scrabble back down the foot and handholds. Zach got there first and began descending as fast as he could. Tony was next. His face turned into a wash of horror as he went down. My dad's heart was hammering into his brain by now. He turned and saw the eyes only about 20 feet from him. The stench of decay was overpowering. It made his stomach turn. As fast as he could, he placed his feet in the first set of footholds and started clambering down the rock face. He could hear the creature's breath now, and even feel it. He refused to look up as he was going down, trying to concentrate on the hand and footholds. He heard Tony scream from below him, and looked to see Tony lose his hold and slip about 5 feet from the bottom. He landed on his side and began to scream with pain. My dad slowed himself a bit, still not daring to look back up. After what seemed like an eternity, he leaped from the cliffside down the last 2 feet. Zach was helping Tony to his feet, and Tony was frozen looking at the cave and ancient staircase. All the color gone from his face. My dad was in full panic, and not looking, grabbed Tony and helped Zach drag him away. They flew down the little canyon, Finally, before they passed the turn, my dad looked back to see the red eyes watching them from the darkness. Another screech rang from the cave, and at that moment, Sarge in a full run came from around the bend, growling and barking. He ran to the foot and handhold staircase and bellowed up that cave, the hair on his back standing straight up, snarling and growling. The sounds of the dog filled the canyon. As my dad turned the corner, he saw those red eyes retreat back into the cave. They emerged from the small canyon and stopped briefly to catch their breath. The sounds of Sarge barking and growling echoing down the canyon. Tony at this point was now crying, his face washed with pain. His arm, he said. He thinks he broke it. Zach was silent. My dad was then asking Tony if he could make it home. Tony responded he sure the hell wasn't staying anywhere near whatever that was. Suddenly, a shrill cry came from the canyon. It was a dog, in pain. "Sarge," my dad cried, but Tony and Zach had started running down the trail. My dad screamed again, tears coming from his eyes. There was no response. It was quiet. My dad thinks he hears something. He looks up to the canyon entrance. It sounds like drums. My dad sits there confused. Drums? What the hell? Is he losing his mind? The drums are getting loud. Is this in his mind? Where is Sarge? He can't leave him. My dad sees Zach tearing back up the trail. "Luke, we have to go." The drums are louder now, and he can hear faint chanting. Zach grabs my dad and jerks him to his feet. "Don't you hear that?" He screams and shakes my dad. "We have to run, now." My dad is woken from his grief as fear washes over him again. He runs down the trail with Zach. Tony is waiting at the edge of the arroyo, waiting for them. The wash is now running, about 6 inches deep. They notice for the first time that a large thunderhead has developed to the south. A huge, large black storm dominating the southern horizon, lightning flashing in the distance. A new source of danger crosses my dad's mind. He tells Tony and Zach they need to cross the arroyo as fast as possible. If it floods, they will be stuck on the side with the basalt ridge, with whatever that thing was. They make their way down carefully and slowly. Tony is having a hard time because of his injured arm. They now start hearing thunder rolling across the air, and the wind has increased. My dad is keeping a close eye on the creek, which has only risen a couple of more inches. They make all the way down and across the creek. The place where they crossed is only 30 yards or so ahead, so they scrabble their way towards it. The water starts rising now, at an alarming rate. They start going as fast as their legs will carry them. They're exhausted, but keep pushing on. Suddenly, my dad, who is in the rear, starts to hear loud splashing coming from behind him. His heart drops. It followed them. It's getting closer. He closes his eyes, bracing for impact. That's when he feels something lick the back of his swinging hand. He turns, bracing for impact, and sees Sarge. Joy fills my dad. He bends down and gives Sarge a quick hug as the dog runs past, and the dog bounds after Tony and Zach as they climb out of the arroyo. My dad runs and begins to climb. When he's almost to the top, he hears crashing and loud snapping coming from the arroyo. Making it to the top, he sees a wave of brown debris filled water crash through the wash. He falls to his butt and watches as the flash flood fills the little canyon. Tony and Zach are lying on the ground, gasping for air. My dad tries to catch his breath. He feels dizzy. He feels tears welling up, and Sarge comes and licks his face. My dad sees that Sarge is covered with blood. He looks over the dog and finds several slash wounds on his back. His ear is also torn. They don't look too deep, but he can't be sure. Zach is the first to speak. He is asking what it was, but no one responds. Tony's arm is beginning to swell pretty badly, and it's only a few hours till dusk. They're all thirsty, and realize in their panic they left their packs in the small canyon, along with their canteens. They are no longer in a hurry. They are exhausted. They drink some rainwater that has pooled in one of the large sandstone boulders. They figure whatever that thing was, it's not going to be getting across the arroyo for a few hours. So they slowly make their way back to Concho as the thunderhead to the south continues to fill the landscape. The 3 boys and Sarge make it home around 8. The sun has set, and my grandparents and great uncle and aunt are worry sick. They are relieved and angry until they see the condition of the trio and the dog. The boys tell them about their horrendous tale, and Tony's parents rush Tony to the nearest doctor. That night, my dad sleeps with Sarge at the end of his bed. Despite him being extremely exhausted, he is plagued with nightmares. One that he speaks about all the time is especially terrifying, where he sees the red eyes looking in through his window. When he wakes up though, in the morning, his curtains are closed. The rain continued for 2 or 3 days. The boys don't leave their homes, still terrified of what happened. My grandpa and great uncle are convinced what the boys encountered was a mountain lion, but they are intrigued by the story of the cave they found. A few days later, when the weather is clear, they tell the boys they want to see the cave. They make the journey faster this time, using my great uncle's Jeep. My grandpa and great uncle also bring along a couple of shotguns and rifles in case this lion is still in the cave. The boys show them the arroyo, which has been filled with new boulders and broken trees from the flooding. They find the trail and start making their way up. My grandpa on the front and great uncle taking the rear. They find the boys' packs caught in a cedar bush. They have been shredded. My grandpa figures they must have been caught by another flood, and they ended up in the trees. They finally make it to the little hidden canyon, which has been blocked by a juniper that washed down during the rain. My grandpa and great uncle get the log out of the way, and they go to the canyon to the Indian staircase. When they look up though, they can make out the darkness of the cave. The water washed away all signs of the boys' previous passage. My grandpa figures maybe at this time of day, the cave is more illuminated, so he and my great uncle climb up the foot and handholds to the top. The boys wait at the bottom, having no desire to go back up there again. It's only my dad and Zach. Tony with his broken arm stayed home. My grandpa calls down for them to climb up. They do as they are told and climb up. When my dad reaches the top, he is stunned. The cave is gone. It's only a 20-foot rock alcove next to a black basalt cliff covered with petroglyphs. He's confused, looks around. He goes over to the wall looking for cracks and sees nothing. My grandpa and great uncle end up questioning the boys. Were they making up stories? No, they weren't. Something attacked Sarge, and the boys hadn't made up being that scared. The dads aren't mad. It's a neat area. Maybe some other weekend they will look for the cave again. My dad and Zach know that this is where the cave was. There's no doubt in their minds. They found their packs and even passed by the UFO petroglyph, but they can't convince the adults, so they make their way to the Jeep that is parked on the far bank of the arroyo. As they load up, sun sinking low in the western sky, my dad looks back at the black basalt ridge, wondering if maybe it was all just a dream, but something in the shadow of a cliff catches his eye. He squints against the sun and sees 2 red shining eyes looking back at him. His blood goes cold. He turns around as the Jeep pulls away. My grandparents only stayed in Concho for another few months. As soon as my grandpa finished the highway project, he got a job offer in the U.S. Virgin Islands. My dad said after that encounter, he had nightmares every night and would swear that at night he would see the red eyes outside of the house until they finally moved from Concho. After he moved, he never had a nightmare about the eyes again. But it wasn't his last encounter with the red-eyed creature. He would see it again when he became an adult. But that is a story for another time. As legend goes, to become a skinwalker, you must attain priesthood and then kill a member of your own family. Then, and only then, can you gain the powers to shapeshift. Then, and only then, are you a true skinwalker. According to local folklore, a man had just done that. An Indian priest not only killed one, but 5 immediate members of his family. They never caught this man. He disappeared into the woods, never to be seen again. When Jason and Alex set out for their camping trip, they knew all the old legends, and they laughed at the idea that a skinwalker would come get them if they ventured out onto the old native land, the same land that the supposed murders took place. And why should they believe the legends? A legend of a man becoming a beast? Jason and Alex were brothers. They spent their entire lives together until Jason had gotten married. Then, Jason moved away and started a family. But not Alex. Alex stayed in their hometown, tending to their parents, making an honest living off the land, and tried to be a good person. And Alex had succeeded at this. He hadn't broken a commandment in years, and was well on his way, well, in his own mind, to heaven. 3 years had passed between their last get-together, and 3 more might have passed if Alex didn't insist on a camping trip. But insist he did, and there they were. It was getting dark, and the 2 of them were laying out under the stars. They were deep in the woods, and they had no GPS or maps, but they knew the path back from where they were. They had gone there as kids. Never know, huh? Alex replied. He only caught bits and pieces sometimes. We can never let Dad know, Jason said. Know what? That we stayed on the old native land past dark. We promised him as kids, and I wouldn't want to upset him now. He's getting pretty close to dead, and if we started an argument now, we may not resolve it in time. For, just don't tell him or Ma, okay? Okay, sure. They both were silent for a while, until up creeped a small raccoon. Well, look at that, Alex called, as he pointed towards the critter. It stared at them for several minutes, not moving, not attempting to flee when they motioned towards it. It stayed, almost perfectly, still. And then, finally, it left. Minutes later came a deer, and again the creature stayed and watched them. Unwavering determination glared in its eyes. For almost 2 hours the brothers were kept awake, as every animal they knew to live in the forest, and some they were almost sure that didn't inhabit the area, came to gaze upon them. The final animal was a gray wolf. It slowly moved towards them, and when it was 5 feet away, it stopped. Don't move. Don't panic. It'll go, Jason assured Alex. The wolf slowly stood up on its hind legs, and then its limbs began to contort and pop. Horror slid over Jason and Alex's faces as they saw the fur tear open, revealing light brown flesh underneath, Finally, they gazed upon what looked like a man with a wolf head. The skull of the wolf split open like a melon, the fur sliding off of it, the bone chipping and falling like a fragile eggshell. And then in its pace, slowly grew out the head of a man. The man now stood before the paralyzed brothers. They couldn't seem to move.
This is my land,
said the man with an almost supernatural smile. Get the fuck away from us, Jason said as fiercely as he could. The man began to laugh, and as he continued to laugh, the pitch changed. It grew deeper, from that of a man to that of a demon, and soon it sounded as if the devil himself was out to get them. The man's skin grew black as coal, and his eyes yellow like a cat's. His demonic laughter echoed through the forest as he drew closer and closer. The brothers being unarmed, they had no choice other than to flee, and that's what they did. They ran as fast as they could, except instead of out to their cars, they were cornered into running deeper into the woods. For hours they seemed to play cat and mouse. Several times animals they passed would burst open, revealing the deranged man. But they continued to run. Finally, reaching a cabin, they ducked inside. They were filled with fear, and the brothers felt that leaving the cabin would result in them dying. What they found in the cabin made them regret their ignorance on legends. For in the main bedroom of the cabin were corpses, at least 100 of them. Every animal they had seen that night was there. And then they saw larger bodies, human bodies. It was then that the man burst into the room, except he was once more a wolf. In his deep voice, he said,
welcome home.
The following week, the police found the cabin during their search for Jason and Alex. They found the brothers, but their faces looked as if they were eaten by an animal of some sort. 6 days later, a security camera several states over caught Alex filling up a car with gas. Several witnesses also reported seeing the dead man, and on nearly all accounts, he was seen smiling, a wide, unnatural grin. My friends and I were out camping in Maryland near a river. We set up a whole weekend where we could go tubing, which meant that we were going to get in these giant inflatable tires and float down the river. We got there on Friday, go tubing on Saturday, and leave on Sunday. It was me, my girlfriend, her best friend, and her boyfriend. The four of us were supposed to have a great weekend together that instead turned into a nightmare that will keep me away from the outdoors for good. I'm pretty sure I had an encounter with the goat man. We arrived on Friday. We set up our tents at the designated campground and made dinner. There were no other campers around us since school had started up again, so we had the area to ourselves. We drank all night, the other three drinking more than me because I'm not a fan of the hard stuff, just a few beers. It was around midnight when I had to go pee, so I left the campsite and walked down the path a little bit into the woods. When I found a good spot, I unzipped my pants and began to relieve myself. When I looked ahead, and faintly, in the moonlight, I saw something moving in between the trees. The moon was about half full, so there wasn't much light to make out the features. The leaves and sticks crunched underneath it. Just as I was finishing up, this thing started to make this weird noise. It sounded like a muffled goat sound, but not quite right. Like a person was imitating a goat. It kept walking around like it was looking for something, but whatever it was scaring me. So I ran back to the campsite and acted like it didn't happen. My friends were so drunk I don't know how they would have reacted. The next morning, I woke up before everyone else, so I made breakfast. At around noon, we drove up the river about 3 miles using the camp's van service that would drop us off, and we would tube down the river back to our campsite. I had pretty much forgotten about the weird encounter from the previous night until I had a weird feeling of somebody watching us as we were floating down the river. It was nothing but woods on both sides of the river, so I couldn't really confirm my feelings. But it ruined the whole experience while going down the river. It creeped the hell out of me. My friend started to feel it too when I told them. The other boyfriend claims he saw someone on the riverbank, but no one else saw it. Once we got back to camp, I told him what I saw Friday night, and it really creeped him out. That's when the boyfriend said the thing he saw kind of looked like a weird shaped man from a distance. We were all scared and decided that we would leave first thing in the morning. After a while, we began drinking again, and pretty much forgot about our fears and for a moment, had fun again. It wasn't until later that night that my fear returned. We were all pretty drunk at this point, and then we started to hear those noises again. It started off in the distance at first, then got closer and closer to our campsite. We started to hear noises all around us, like twigs breaking, scratching on trees, and more of those goat noises mixed with a man growling. None of us had a weapon, so we were all pretty scared, and we all huddled close to each other. The scariest part was that the bugs stopped making noises. Eventually, we all drank some more and fell asleep around the campfire. I woke up in the middle of the night, most likely because I sensed something was wrong. I'm not sure how to explain it, but it was like sleep paralysis, or something where I couldn't move and couldn't speak. I opened my eyes, and I saw this terrifying thing in between all of us. It had the body of a skinny man with a distorted face and long, unnatural arms. I saw that it was pacing back and forth between us. It would stop and look at my girlfriend, and then it would arch its back and act like it was chuckling. It kept twitching its body and sniffing the air around everyone. This thing finally came over to me and looked me in the eyes. It had these dark pitted eyes, and its mouth was wet. It got close to me and opened its mouth, making that noise into my face. The noise must have woken the boyfriend, and he started to scream, which scared the creature, and it ran off on all fours back into the woods. I was finally able to move, and I crawled over to my girlfriend and held her the rest of the night. First thing in the morning, we packed our stuff and checked out at the main lodge. We will never go back to those woods in Maryland again. There is something living out there, and I'm telling you the story because I don't want anything to happen to you. Hey everyone, I could really use some help here as I'm starting to get really worried. Last night, I was followed by a very creepy lady when I was out hiking in my local trails at state land. I have hiked and hunted these trails my whole life, and not once have I encountered anything like this. Don't get me wrong, I had my fair share of scary things happen to me when I gone solo camping, but this has scared me right to the bone, and now I think I'm being followed. Let me explain what's been going on, and hopefully one of you may be able to help me out here. Last night, Christmas Eve, I had nothing to do as I have no kids, no wife, and my parents live 3 hours away. So to kill some time and not be bored, I had the idea of going on a solo hike through our local trails. Like I said, I have hiked these trails many times. This time, however, I'll never forget. I got out to the trailhead about 5 p.m. I had my headlamp on, and I knew these trails like the back of my hand, so I wasn't too concerned with the sunlight quickly fading. I don't know if any of you are from Michigan, but we're having a surprisingly sunny and warm December. However, it still gets dark here around 5:30. The weather was beautiful and perfect for a nighttime walk. We don't have too many nice winter days like this, so I wanted to take full advantage and enjoy warm night air. So I got out of my truck and started up the trailhead. This specific trail I was on started out in dense pine trees, and after a mile or so, it opened up to these awesome valleys with huge fields. Most of the time, if I was quiet enough and looked around, I could see some deer grazing and other wildlife. This time though, there was nothing. I was quite surprised there wasn't a single animal, considering how beautiful of a night it was. Now that I think about it, I didn't see or hear even a squirrel in the pines, which is very uncommon. There are many in these parts, and no matter the time, I can always hear them running and playing in the trees. This time, it was dead quiet. I kept on walking though, and just enjoyed the peace and quiet. Once I exited the pines and entered the first field, I started to get this nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, like something was watching me. I chalked it up to me being paranoid because of the lack of wildlife, and continued on. I wish I would have turned back right then and there, but if I did, I wouldn't be here telling you the story, would I? Anyways, I continued on and the feeling just intensified as I progressed. At this point, I was a good mile and a half in, and it dawned on me, if there was something out here with me, I was screwed. Not a single person knew that I was out here. I never had cell phone reception in this area. If some kind of animal was stalking me, I would just be done for. I was kicking myself in the ass for not bringing my handgun with me, honestly. We don't have a whole lot of dangerous game here in central Michigan, so I didn't think twice about it when leaving. I was nearing the end of the first field, and before I stepped into the next little section of pines, I decided to take a quick look around, just to satisfy that nagging feeling in the back of my mind. At first, I didn't see anything, but just as I was about to turn back around, something caught my attention. There was slight movement, back about 100 yards behind me. What the heck? I whispered as I squinted to get a better look. I wasn't sure, but it looked like a figure, half hidden behind a bush. I stared closely, and when I saw it shift slightly, my heart leaped into my throat. The figure was definitely humanoid, and it appeared to be staring right at me. "Hey," I foolishly called out, hoping whoever it was would simply identify itself. As soon as I said that, the figure quickly ducked behind the bush, disappearing from my view. My heart was racing pretty good at this point, a million worst case scenarios running through my mind. I couldn't help but think it was a serial killer, ready to pounce and stab me to death, stashing my body in these woods. I turned around and started walking a little faster, trying to distance myself from whoever was out here with me. To my horror, I heard twigs and sticks snapping a little ways behind me as the person started to follow me. "I have a gun," I shouted, trying to scare them into leaving me alone. I looked back over my shoulder to see where they were at, and when I did, my heart started hammering in my chest. I swear I thought I was gonna pass out. The person was now maybe 20 feet behind me, and I could tell it was a woman, except that her jaw was hung open, as if in complete shock, her eyes open extremely wide, staring directly at me. When I first turned around, she was still walking, and the way she moved scared me so bad it sent me into a dead sprint upon looking at her. I know it sounds kind of funny, but believe me, it wasn't. She was tiptoeing as quiet as she could, in the same way a cartoon character would try to be sneaky. Her legs taking these huge, lanky steps. Everything about the way she looked and moved just sent these shivers down my spine. "Leave me alone," I shouted as I ran away as fast as I could. That's when I started to hear her laughing as she chased me. She was no longer trying to be quiet, as I could hear her crashing through the woods, catching up to me rather quickly. I decided to turn and run off the trail once I rounded a bend, where I knew she couldn't see me for a moment. As soon as I stepped off, I quickly hid behind a tree and turned off my headlamp. After a couple of seconds, I heard the sound of her heavy, odd footsteps as she got closer and closer. I held my breath and slammed my eyes shut, sending a quick prayer to the Lord above to just let her pass. Her horrible laughing sounds echoed through the woods as she thankfully ran past me. As soon as her footsteps sounded a little further down, I jumped out from behind the tree and took off running back the way I came. I hadn't even gotten 20 feet when I heard a blood-curdling scream coming from behind me in the woods. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, running on pure adrenaline and the will to live. I just knew if she caught me I wouldn't make it, and it would be a horrible, painful way to die. The sound of her footsteps once again got louder and louder as she got closer. How the hell was she running so fast? I felt a huge wave of relief as I saw the entrance to the trail, maybe 100 feet ahead. Somehow, I ran even faster as I knew my truck would be right there. I digged into my pockets and fished my keys out. She let out another hideous scream as she got even closer, maybe 50 feet behind me now. I got into my truck and jumped in, putting my keys in the ignition and starting it in record time. I backed out and peeled out of there as fast as I could without losing control. After one final scream of frustration, I looked in my rearview mirror to watch the woods disappear. The whole drive home I kept checking behind me, afraid I would see her chasing after me, even though I knew it would be impossible at 60 miles per hour. 5 minutes later, I pulled into my driveway and jumped out of the truck once parked, running full blast inside. I slammed the door behind me and locked it. I ran all around my house, locking every window and door, not feeling safer until I knew I was locked up and safe. I walked upstairs to my bedroom and laid in bed. After a little while, I must have passed out from being exhausted. I awoke to the pitch black room and quiet house. My heart started racing as I remembered the lady from the forest, and I jumped up to look out my window. No, I whispered as I looked in my backyard. The lady from the woods was standing in my backyard, slack-jawed, and staring right up at me. My heart once again pounded so hard I thought I would faint. As soon as she noticed me, she smiled this huge, impossible, wide ear-to-ear grin. She then shrieked that awful scream again and ran back into the woods. Needless to say, I didn't sleep after that. And that's why I'm here. If anyone has an idea what the hell this lady is, as I know there's no way she's human, can someone please let me know? Maybe give me some advice on what to do here. Thanks in advance. My father died about 5 years ago, unexpectedly, from a heart attack. To say it was difficult on my mother and I was an understatement. Our old house in Knoxville just didn't feel like home anymore. About a year later, Mom and I made plans to take ourselves and our elderly dog, Ace, on a move further south to a small town situated about half an hour from ATL. Just a few days before we were supposed to move, I had one of the most vivid dreams I ever come to experience. All that was within my dream was my bedroom, a picture perfect of the real thing. I sometimes wonder if it was in some sort of sleep paralysis state when it occurred. To further add to the dream's realism, in the middle of the night, the street lights right across the street would illuminate through my window, creating a light reflection on the wall perpendicular. In my dream, as I lay there staring at the exact reflection on the wall, I saw an orb of smoke fading from the shadows. Goosebumps chilled across my skin as I lay there panicked and afraid to move a muscle. Suddenly, it stopped moving and hung in the light's reflection, as if it was staring at me. Without warning, it spoke to me. In my dead father's voice, I'm sending something to watch you. Despite hearing my father's voice come from the orb, I became terrified. I'm not sure why, and yet I managed to let out a small reply towards it. "What?" I whispered. The orb stayed silent for a few moments, leaving an eerie dead silence in the voice's place. Just as quickly, it spoke to me one final time. "Down, Black." I woke up almost instantly, gasping for breath. The nightmare had chilled me to my core. I'm not sure exactly what to make of it, especially those two final words. I chalked it up to maybe Dad wishing us well on our move, but at the time, I couldn't shake the feeling it was some kind of warning. Within the next couple of weeks, my mother and I moved out of Knoxville and headed south to Georgia. She had managed to find a little house for us, with only one or two neighbors down a gravel road in the middle of the woods. It was a nice fit for us. The best reliever of all the stress that came with the move was our new neighbor's cat. She was a petite, older black cat that gravitated towards me almost instantly, and I treated her as if she was my own pet. I left out a can of food once or twice a week for her, and even if I didn't call out for her, when she saw me outside, she would always run up to me. She actually helped me ease my tensions about leaving Knoxville behind, especially without Dad there with us. Less than a month into our new home, I woke up suddenly to a faint coughing noise that sounded like it was coming from downstairs. One thing to know about our dog Ace, he has a condition in his trachea. He needs medicine to help calm the condition down, so I'm used to waking up in the middle of the night to give him his medicine. I proceeded downstairs from my bedroom to give him his cough medicine, but I couldn't find him anywhere throughout the house. He wasn't in his bed sleeping. He wasn't in the kitchen. He was nowhere to be found. I didn't check my mom's bedroom because I didn't want to wake her up. Besides, I wouldn't have heard the coughing if he was in there anyways, so I just let it be. That's when I heard the cough again, but it was coming from further away, as if it was from outside. I looked over at the side patio door leading out into the woods, and realized I had forgot to close it. There it stood, slightly open. Shit, I thought to myself, he got out. I immediately ran outside with a flashlight and started calling out for my dog. Ace! Ace! I shouted into the trees. I heard another cough and shined my light in its direction. This time it had echoed from down the gravel road. I thought my dog was lost, and I chalked it up to new house jitters. So I said, Ace, come on boy, home's this way buddy. That's when I heard it. The cough that I had been following, almost right beside me. But this time, it didn't stay like the dry cough I had been hearing. Instead, the cough had slowly descended into a low growl. I shined my light towards the new sound, and there stood a bright red fox in the middle of the path. I figured it was some kind of sick fox I had mistaken for my dog. The whole time, as I was processing what I was seeing, it stared directly at me. Its eyes glowed from the light of my flashlight. However, our stare broke when it tilted its head to the right. I looked down, and there she was, our neighbor's little black cat standing beside me. However, it was as if she had completely changed who she was. She was no longer the happy, affectionate cat that I had come to know. Instead, she had her back arched upright, every fiber of hair standing at attention, and she let out the lowest growl I had ever heard. In that moment, I figured she was just scared of the fox, so I knelt down beside her in a bid to move her away and avoid the fox hurting her. But no matter how many times I tried to move her out of fight mode, she wouldn't budge. Her stare remained unfazed. That's when I looked towards the direction of the fox once more. But there wasn't a fox standing there anymore. Instead, in the exact same spot of that gravel road, was a walking, rotting corpse of a roadkill coyote, slowly moving towards me. I took a step back, absolutely horrified of what I was seeing. Its jaw was hanging loose from its face. One of its eyes was stained with blood, and it wobbled back and forth as if it was desperately fighting pain. I rubbed my eyes out of disbelief, hoping I was imagining it, hoping I was dreaming it, but it was still there when my eyes reopened. Despite the sight before us, our neighbor's black cat, no matter how tiny she was, stood there and kept growling at the creature. Suddenly, it stopped. The creature had ceased its walk towards us. For a moment, it just stood there, glancing back and forth between myself and this little black cat that was trying to defend me. That's when I heard this creature say two words in a low, Voice. Down. Black. In a flash, the creature ran straight into the woods. I shined my flashlight in its direction, but it had completely vanished. Even the brush it had ran through looked untouched. That's when the cat, still standing beside me, calmed herself down, almost as if nothing had happened. She rubbed herself up against my leg, returning to her normal, loving mood. Despite technically not being mine, I proceeded to scoop her up and run back into the house. Before heading upstairs with the little black cat snuggled up in my arms, I decided to poke my head into my mother's room. Laying on the floor, sound asleep, was Ace. He had been there the entire time. I quietly closed her door before going upstairs. I made sure that the little cat slept with me in my bed that night. From the research I'd done, I think I was almost a victim of some kind of Skinwalker. It must have picked up the sounds my dog sometimes makes late at night, knowing that I would likely come to his aid. And for whatever reason, our neighbor's black cat had scared it so badly, it scrambled away. I haven't seen it since that night. Maybe because that cat still likes to wander down the gravel road late at night. Or maybe that thing just decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Either way, whether I have my father or pure luck to thank, I leave a can of food out every single night for that little black cat. And you know the most ironic part of everything? That cat's name is Halloween.